these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office, experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
For insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all, in-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths.
We hold these truths.
with Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back, everybody. Election season is coming up, and so both sides have different narratives about how the economy is doing. The ones in power, Biden administration, they say the economy is doing great. You're welcome. Bidenomics is fantastic. Of course, we all say, no, it's not. And even if it, to the extent that it might be doing well, that's no thanks to you. But one thing they do point out is the unemployment rate. Undeniably a very, very low unemployment rate. Now, here's the thing. There's got to be some context associated with that. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Inflation is still very high. It's outpaced wage growth. Average monthly mortgage payments on new homes is up 98% from 4 years ago. Price of food is up 21% since Biden took office. All around the board, energy prices are up. Interest on the national debt has now eclipsed military spending. And what we're going to talk about today is workforce participation. It continues to plummet. I think it's been a long trend, but our expert today, David Bahnsen, will tell us more about that. So David's a good friend of mine. He's been on this Hold These Truths before. You'll see him a lot on Fox Business, CNBC, all the news stations, and of course his own podcast, Capitol Records, I think, right, David?
Capital Record, you got it.
If you want to go to a place to hear intelligent conversations about the economy, he's a financial advisor. So David, welcome back.
Well, thanks for having me again. Always a pleasure, Congressman.
So as I teased there, we're talking about disturbing trends in the labor force. You just wrote a new book. What's the name of the new book?
Full-time Work and the Meaning of Life.
Work and the Meaning of Life. And I've gone through it. I like it. I mean, I think it's a cool, and I think an important in our modern day look, a take on work being both important for your financial stability, but also your mental health and your general well-being and sense of purpose. So we'll get into that. But you really do talk a lot about work as a cultural tenet, as a kind of a good, as a meaning of life kind of thing. Why do you think that? Why go that direction? Do you think we've lost that understanding that we used to have it?
I do. And even when you see something like Senator Bernie Sanders proposing a 32-hour work week, and then the right immediately gets intuitively kind of lathered up, furious, for really good reason. It's an absolutely terrible idea. He's wrong on every level. And I am a movement conservative since kindergarten. So when I offer this criticism to my friends on the right, it isn't as an enemy, it's as a friend. But what we immediately do is say a 32-hour work week's a terrible idea. It would hurt the economy. And also, don't you know that, we need the state to stay out of these kinds of things. And in my day, we used to walk uphill, 9 miles and work hard. And now none of you darn Gen Zers or millennials want to work hard anymore. More or less, everything that we have said there, I agree with. And yet none of it, I think, is likely to prevail as the right argument in defeating terrible policy ideas from the AOCs and Bernie Sanders of the world, because it's not rooted to what their argument is rooted to, which is the belief, in their opinion, that human beings are happiest when they're not working. And my belief is that human beings are happiest when they are working, when they have purpose, when they have meaningful activity. And so when we want to sit around and debate the merits of what it will mean economically, the unintended consequences, all of those things matter. This is essentially a backdoor 20% increase in wages because the same amount of work, the same amount of wage for 20% less time is obviously inversely expressed as a 20% increase. I mean, there's all kinds of problems with it. But I think that what we do is ignore the moral argument he's making to our own peril. Karl Marx believed that human beings were happiest in leisure and recreation, and that work was an antagonist to the soul of the human being. And that if we could just merely find time to fish in the morning and write poetry in the evening, we'd all be happier people. This is Marx's exact words. And I think that what we have to do is the more embedded in the ethos of the American experiment is the belief that when we're producing things, when we're having our needs met by meeting the needs of others, when we're being useful to other people, this sort of earned success is really what provokes human happiness. That's the argument I want to make.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I guess playing devil's advocate, because maybe some of the counter arguments would be, well, does it have to be like a W-2 work? Does it have to be working for the big corporation that you hate? And maybe it does if your goal is to get to a certain point in your life. I notice myself as you're talking about this, I'm thinking, how I manifest this reality in my own life. And obviously I have a job that pays. And people always ask, "Hey, Dan, like, how you doing? You busy? You guys seem pretty busy." I'm like, "I'm very busy. I don't know if I'm productive, but I'm busy."
Yeah.
But that's the nature of being in politics. It's you're pulling a boulder, pushing a boulder uphill. And so one of the ways I actually engage in my own sort of therapy is housework. Building a new custom closet, like figuring out how to do electrical and install lighting and build fences and just like actually produce something. Do you mean that or do you not mean that? I mean, because maybe it could be a little bit of both. Because there's an argument that we have a very low workforce participation, and it's going to screw our country long term because there's just not enough people actually adding to the economy. That's an economic argument, and there's this other argument that people are just lazy. Somebody might not be lazy, like as we would think of them. They're not fishing or just writing stupid poetry, but they're also not contributing a ton to the economy in maybe a traditional way. Is that okay?
Yeah, no, so I would define work as producing goods and services that meet the needs of others. And I would define working on our stamp collection or project around the house as something more in the vein of a hobby. And it's, of course, totally okay. But it isn't necessarily within the definition of work. But not everything we do in our lives is going to be work. There is absolutely room for leisure, recreation, hobbies, and so forth. But the distinction I would want to avoid is where people believe I'm referring to only compensable work. And I don't think that's true. I think that a great example, of course, in our tradition of families, stay-at-home mothers are generally not being paid anything and then doing an incredible amount of productive activity. So the focus of the book is not meant to be on the paycheck. Look, only 18% of our workforce works for the S&P 500. There is still, by and large, the predominant amount of people in our country that are employed by smaller sized businesses. And so there's any number in a dynamic economy. This is why we need to continue advocating for a market economy and for the classical liberal order that has sustained it, because the division of labor and specialization and labor dynamism are all gifts of that environment. The fact of the matter is the reason people have so many options in the workforce to work in the state they were raised in, or to move out of state to work for a big company or small company. The one economic data point that has really held up quite well, even now several years past the COVID moment, is new business applications. There are still a lot of new people starting new businesses, and a bunch of them are going to fail, and that's all good, because that's what is supposed to happen in a market economy. Risk takers go out there, try things, and some things will work and some things will not. But I think though that there's no need for me to define the the existential, economic, and cultural argument I'm making for work as going to work for a W-2 job. I think there's a lot of flexibility in what that entails.
Yeah, and of course the point about a mother taking care of kids, that is work. That is work.
No, sure.
And
Yeah.
it's absolutely important. I mean, she could not do it, but then you have to pay somebody to do it. So maybe you're doubling the amount of people working, but then you don't get to spend time with your kids. Trade-offs. Everything's about trade-offs. Speaking about labor force participation specifically, though, I mean, where are we seeing the biggest alarm bells?
Well, you could even argue that at this point, there's no alarm bells other than in where the biggest is. For a while post-COVID, we were seeing it across the board. But look, the biggest alarm bell is prime working age men, those in between the ages of 29 and 54 that have voluntarily left the workforce. Our workforce participation and 55 and over has come way down since the financial crisis. But after dropping in COVID, it has come back up, at least to its pre-COVID level. And it's not going to get back to its financial crisis level, I'm sad to say. But the data point that has dropped and dropped more and has not come back at all are prime working age men, where you're basically at about 85 or 86% of them that either have a job or are looking for a job.
Okay.
That is turning the Great Depression on its head. There was 85 or 86% of them that had a job in the Great Depression. Yet they're 100% of the ones who weren't working. It was because they couldn't find a job. Now it's about 90% of those that aren't working. You can't find the workers. And so we just are dealing with a cultural epidemic with prime working age men.
So, but the rate is around 85%, and that's remained consistent. It's just what's changed is what's going on with the other 15%.
We're measuring two different things, and so with the Great Depression, you were talking about unemployment, and with the labor participation force, it's measuring something different. But see, that's where when you talk about 3 to 4% unemployment, which is a very good statistic, okay, for a while they would have considered it full employment. The problem is that it doesn't measure what the labor participation force does, which is those that have voluntarily left the workforce. So back of napkin, there's 330 million people in the country, 267 million of them are over the age of 16. So you have an addressable adult population of 267 million. And of that, only 167 million, 62.5%, are saying that they have a job or are looking for a job. The unemployment rate is the amount of people unemployed from that 167 million. And that's only 3 to 4%, and that's been pretty constant for a while. But the labor participation force is the 167 million divided by the 267 million. And we're down 14 million people from the labor force since the financial crisis, from 67.5% to 62.5%. That to me speaks to a cultural epidemic.
And you also write about the younger age, 16 to 24, which is also a much more dramatic drop. It was 68% in 1990. Now it's about 56%. So both of these stories, or both of these statistics, I guess, tell us maybe somewhat different stories. You can imagine why a lot of younger kids aren't in the labor force. Cultural changes, their parents are richer, they want to go to grad school. That I don't know. Everybody's got a different story. But for your working age males, I agree with you. That does seem to be a pretty big red alarm. And of course, our first question is, well, then what are they doing? Like, how are they surviving? It's not like you have 14 million people just starving on the street. So what are they doing, and how do we even collect data on what they're doing?
Well, there's a number of things that Nick Eberstadt and others have done to help assemble that data. Let's assume that 4 million of the 14 million are financially independent, sold their crypto, some other nonsense, .com, stock options, I don't know. I don't really believe it's that much, but I'm just going to pretend. What I do know is it's not 14 million. And what I do know is that we have a 980% increase in disability claims. And I do not believe that back pain is contagious. What we do know is we have the highest number ever in the history of our country of people living at home at age 30. What I do know is that we have the highest level of transfer payments that we've ever had. I think it's all the above. I think it is boys that do not become men, that are coddled, that live at home, that are able to collect a few bucks, this and that, and get by with very little aspiration. There is a perfect correlation between this and the so-called data points of despair, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, God forbid, even suicide. This is an epidemic, and it is emotional, spiritual, economic, all of these things. And that's where I think the biggest source of sadness ought to be. But that teenage employment thing, if I could come back to that one, Dan, I don't know that we should be content to say, well, mom and dad are richer now. That's certainly true. There is less of a need for teenagers and even college students. Now, with college students, I think a lot of it is because they've wrapped beer money into their student loans. They've figured out how they can kind of get a little extra spending cash where they used to need to work in college.
I didn't want to imply I was content with it, but I just wanted
Oh,
to
no,
imply
no, I know you weren't.
that I had some kind of explanation at least,
Yeah.
but I don't have that explanation for your normal working age men.
Yeah, well, but see, for much of our country's history, that age group needed to be employed because they had a spouse, they had kids, they had responsibilities. There's a lot less of a need for a career if you're living at home playing Fortnite.
Yeah, the video game thing is interesting. I've seen a lot of other statistics about massively increased video game use, and now the interesting thing about that particular graph was it was comparing video game use, drug use, sex, all the things that you did in the 80s and 90s as kids, and they've decreased quite a bit. So there's a lot less sex and a lot less drug use, a lot less alcohol use. You hear that from the liquor industry too. Kids do not drink the way, say, we would have.
Yeah.
Your Gen Xers and elder millennial types. It's a different culture. Now, is that good, bad? I don't know, but I don't think it's good that just video games have taken over, though. Because there's a real lack of socialization that as a consequence of the video games, and like I stopped playing video games after GoldenEye. I mean, that was the height. They got too hard after that. Guys would play Call of Duty on deployment, and I'm just like, I cannot keep up with this. And I had 2 eyes at the time. Like, this is just too much. So I don't know. Video games just never did it for me. But there's also the binging of Netflix. I mean, God, I'm guilty of that. And there's a lot of things that can keep you from being more productive than you could be. It kind of takes sort of this like constant shaming of yourself to make yourself just do it. Like, look, you can go down this glide path, or you can put in this amount of effort extra, and you can be somebody that you didn't think you could be. But that takes self-discipline.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that self-shaming is often enough. I think that you need to be shamed by others. And I'm very sympathetic to Charles Murray's arguments here from his book Coming Apart, which is now over a decade old, that I think that one of the biggest problems is that people don't feel shame from the culture around them for things that they ought to be ashamed of. And it was a point that I made the first time I was ever on your podcast, was talking about my very first book, Crisis of Responsibility, where I made the argument that the worst part of the financial crisis was not merely that people walked away from their homes and quit making their own house payment, even when they could afford to. That was the second worst part. The worst part was that they did it and bragged about it.
Yeah.
And you're supposed to be ashamed of yourself not paying your bills.
And you're supposed to be ashamed of yourself if you take a bunch of PPP loans from COVID and you really didn't need it. Instead of bragging about it, and like, there's like a picture, I don't know if it's a real one, but it's a picture of a Lamborghini with PPP loan on the license plate. And you're like, that wasn't the point. It makes me regret, doing what we did and not putting more guardrails on that. It's an emergency situation. You got to do it sometimes to help the people who need it. But God, it makes me sick to think of the people who, again, did the wrong thing, but also bragged about it. That's why I have a chapter in my book called Sense of Shame. So you're right. You need to shame others and more importantly, hold yourself accountable. It's the only way you get better.
Well, if the PPP abuses make you sick, then you shouldn't even look into the data on the ERC, because that employee retention credit was the most abused thing I've ever seen. And what's so interesting is that this is not Congress's fault. I mean, CARES Act was voted on the way it was, and they thought they were going to be shut down for about 6 weeks, and some companies were going to need help with payroll. And the fact that it ended up going on so long, that wasn't done by Congress. The shutdown, the fact that there were still companies shut down a year later, and then the idea that Treasury was cold calling businesses to get them to take money. I mean, it's just an absolutely stupefying moment in American history.
Yeah, and it's sad too, because it's hard to. It's one thing to argue about policy changes that need to take place to sort of change incentives to work. It's another thing to deal with a cultural rot. And, a lot of our discussions these days about policy and politics are rooted in cultural problems. If you have a culture that doesn't feel shame for being unproductive, I mean, you living in an unproductive life that no one will remember, does that make you feel bad? Maybe that's a little too harsh, but it should make you feel a little bit bad. And it's not that hard, by the way, to be remembered. It doesn't mean famous. And I think a lot of people might think that, right? 'Cause you ask kids what they want to be when they grow up, TikTok influencer. Well, and there's some money in that, sure, but trust me, you're probably not going to make it big. And that's famous, but that's not what meaning is. I mean, the people around you, your family, your friends, there's people whose lives you touch. That's what I mean by leaving behind something that you can be remembered by. It doesn't have to be fame. It doesn't have to be a lot of people, but that should at least be the goal, to be remembered by people positively, that you made a positive impact on our grand trajectory of world history in some small way. You should feel proud about it and not proud about having taken from others who've been more productive. One of the things people talk about AI being disruptive in many ways. One of the things I'm worried about with AI is how disruptive it could be to basic class differences, because every technological advance that we've ever dealt with, it can either make you more productive and more awesome, or it can make you more lazy. It can let you get away with being lazy. You have the first plow, and you have two farmers, and one farmer is like, wow, plow's awesome. And he produces 10 times more product than he otherwise would have. But another farmer might be like, well, I can do a tenth of the work now and have the same output. Well, that sounds good. There's two different types of people. And you talk about AI being able to do all the work for you. You can either make AI make you extremely productive and you can do all these amazing things. And there's obviously a lot of people who are going to do that. And that class is going to continue to separate from each other. You talk about inequality. I mean, I'm off on a tangent now, but I think it's related to this cultural problem.
Yeah, and I don't think it's a tangent. I think it's directly related to what we're talking about, Congressman. When Bernie says 32-hour work week, do you think Bezos and Musk are going to cooperate? Are they going to clock out after 32 hours? Are entrepreneurs
Are you? Or is anyone?
Of course not.
Am I?
I mean, and that's the irony, is anybody who would be
My
interested
staff
in
ain't going to do.
a 32-hour work week being appealing to somebody is probably appealing, ironically, to people who aren't even working 32 hours now.
That's probably true.
The idea that a person like myself could get my work done in that amount of time is hysterical. But then my question is, what does that do for wealth inequality and income inequality? When a whole lot of people then get put into a position where the state is mandating that they not work more than this certain amount, while meanwhile the entrepreneurs and risk takers of society continue pressing ahead, producing goods and services, it will exacerbate wealth inequality. Just as you've pointed out, that the usefulness of technology. I think you have a precedent in your question about what AI will do with the internet.
Yeah.
How in the world did we create one of the most powerful things in world history that has totally reordered the way we live our lives, do business, and productivity hasn't gone up at all? How is that even
Right.
possible?
It's
Because
amazing.
people used the internet to be able to get the same amount done with less output.
Yeah. No, you're right. The internet, yeah, it's the AI analogy is really not that far off, because in the end, the internet gives you pretty much access to all the knowledge, as long as you know how to parse through what's bullshit and what isn't. But a lot of
Yeah.
people don't. I've noticed, but it's all there. And so, how are we at a loss to try and figure out how to improve our education system when our founders, in their 20s and 30s, were so well educated. They were writing these founding documents that to this day we look to as these pretty amazing examples of not just good prose, but thoughtful philosophical pen to paper. And these days we're having trouble figuring out how to educate people when they have free internet, and to the extent that they don't, we could solve that problem pretty easily. It's a cultural question. It's a cultural question. Like, why aren't you learning what you need to learn when you actually have everything at your fingertips? It's kind of like it's the whole premise of Goodwill Hunting.
Yeah.
He just went to the local library and he was
Yeah.
really smart. Now, I don't think everybody can probably accomplish that, but now you don't even need to go to the local library. You just need your iPhone, and you can learn what you need to know. There's no good excuse anymore. So to the extent that there is, it's because it's a choice. It's a choice to be less than you could be. And our society can't survive that many more people making that choice. And AI just makes it easier. And it's yet another, hurdle that we'll have to overcome. Unless you have something to add to that, I want to ask you about SSDI.
About SSDI.
Yeah, because one of the things you write about is the explosion, and you mentioned it earlier, the explosion of handouts, the explosion of disability payments. So maybe a little SSDI 101, Social Security Disability Insurance. That's when we say welfare, from a policy perspective, I think everybody just says the word welfare, but you don't necessarily go on quote unquote welfare. There's not like there's different types of welfare programs, but SSDI is one of the biggest ones relating to disability. It's the rise in the usage of SSDI came after welfare reform in the 90s, when there really was welfare, but a lot of people just got put on disability. Like you said, back pain can't possibly be contagious, and there's a real question as to like how many people are actually disabled. I mean, because I could easily qualify for that. I could.
Sure.
I was made very clear to me when I was exiting the Navy that I could also apply for SSDI. Now I lose those benefits as I actually make money and have an income. But are there any policy suggestions or thoughts you have on what we could do to change that incentive structure? Because as you said, it does not pass the sniff test to think that there's just that many more people who have true disabilities who can't work now.
Well, and I think a lot of it isn't at the policy level, because passing a policy that thou shalt not commit fraud is already a policy. And so it really comes down to implementation and execution. And we talk about waste, fraud, and abuse all the time. And I think it comes with the territory with government. There's a massive amount of increase and fraudulent increase in disability claims in the private sector. I know people that are collecting on 2 or 3 disability policies and still working because they're able to game the system and this and that. But the Social Security component that disability represents, and where the states fit in, and then, by the way, you have to add in the unemployment fraud as well. It's a whole issue. I guess the appointment, this would be a Senate thing. So, this Julie Sue, the interim labor secretary, you probably haven't had to mess with that deal yet, but she oversaw in California $40 billion paid out fraudulently. And now she's the Biden administration's labor secretary. The Senate hasn't approved her, thank God, but she's doing it on an interim basis. But they're $40 billion. of checks gone out wrongly and blaming it on fraud and didn't have the systems to stop it. It's an argument for limited government. It's too big to not have it when it gets to that level of system. But I don't think I know of a policy solution other than tightening up the implementation of policies we already have. We should not be using, in a day and age in which Social Security is so underfunded, they should not be using it as a fraudulent mechanism of a transfer payment for able-bodied people in their 30s and 40s.
This gets to your general political, philosophical differences between the left and the right. You talk to Democrats about this, and they can't see beyond the person who actually needs it. That's the only thing they see when they think about the implementation of some of these programs. At least in my discussions, that's what I encounter, and that's problematic. And so you never get anywhere. And I think it just boils down to, I think, of what I call a pathological sense of compassion. You can have too much compassion, and it's like the argument for expanding Medicaid. It's like, well, it seems compassionate. I'm not sure it really is, since you're literally taking somebody else's money and transferring it to somebody else. I don't think that should be considered anything but greedy. If you think of the famous Thomas Sowell quote, why is it greed to take somebody else's money, but not greed to demand that somebody else give you money? And so that's a left and right brain wired kind of difference that's hard to overcome. That way, I think we'll just be arguing about forever. I'm not sure. I kind of lost track.
Well,
of my
I would suggest that there's an even more powerful side to your argument on the charity side of it. Not only does that whole construct and that difference between right and left misdefine what normal people would think of as greedy. The greedy person is the one wanting to hold on to their own money, and the not greedy person is the one trying to take someone else's money. I think that there is a real perversion there, but I would also argue it perverts the definition of charitable. In my world, I very genuinely believe there are those people the left would identify as in true need. And I care about those people so much that I do not want them to build a dependency with the state, an impersonal actor who cannot love them, who cannot know them, who cannot be invested in their life. And so churches and synagogues and local communities and organizations, a subsidiarity approach to dealing with those situations. And this is not hypothetical. This is not utopian. This is the real world. This is where real care gets done. We have all kinds of organizations around the country that do help. Look at the amount of private sector support into veterans that are in need of this support. It's a cause people believe in. That's voluntary. They're giving to it voluntarily. That's charity. How am I being charitable when the money that goes into the welfare system or transfer payment system is coercively taken? There's nothing charitable or virtuous about that. So I think they get the definitions wrong, both for the giver and the receiver.
Yeah, I agree. And that was, you did put the cherry on top of the point that I was getting at, which is the definition of love and compassion. As I like to point out, I'm like, we should treat the American people from a policy perspective as if we love them. You love your kids. And so if you love your kids, you don't tell them that their actions don't matter. You don't tell them that everything is somebody else's fault. Nothing is your fault. You never did anything wrong. That's not a good way to raise your kids. And those good parents, I don't care if you're liberal or conservative, that that's how you raise your kids. And because you actually love them. And, you want them to work X amount of hours to get this amount of allowance, right? That's the kind of parameters you put on somebody you actually love. You don't make them totally dependent on you. And yet that's exactly what this sort of, again, a pathological compassion from the policy level and left would have you do. And it's nonsense. We see it in the veteran community too, because one of the things that annoys me more from the right is, well, Dan, you can't vote on this like Ukraine aid. You can't vote on Ukraine aid when we have homeless veterans. I'm like, guys, if we have about 1,000 programs, way more programs and way more spending than you can possibly realize for veterans. And if if that's your cutoff point, well, then we're never allowed to do anything. You know, there are certain problems individualized to certain people that are genuinely hard to solve, that have a lot more to do with them than they do the services made available to them. But again, that same argument made to the left, it's the same thing. It's like, look, you've got to have a realistic point of view, and you got to treat the American people like you actually love them. And I think that would be a winning message if when we try to take on this battle, to actually right size our entitlements. You know, when we get around to winning some elections and you know, stop arguing about stupid stuff, we can finally focus on the things that actually matter to our economy and our future.
Well,
I do think
there's a lot on the right that are convinced that the left wants that dependency because it then forces, it creates a feedback loop that sustains their power. And I'm not totally sure that theory is mine, because I think my theory is much worse. In other words, at least in that case, there's a very thoughtful, albeit sinister, you know, formulation being made, where I actually think the far worse thing is what I believe is driving it, which is the mere ignorance of understanding these important things in life. I'm not sure how much thoughtfulness there is that goes into it. Now, you see certain crass, cynical type things in politics all the time. I am at a loss to how to interpret President Biden's student loan forgiveness sham as anything other than a rather cynical ploy to try to buy votes. But I think that a lot of times this general political philosophy of you know, when the Obama administration made the Julia video, I don't think they were trying to buy votes from cradle to grave. I think that they genuinely believe in a paternalistic vision of the state.
Right.
And
No, I think you're right.
And I don't.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I don't think they're that strategic or that creative, or well organized in order to, you know, do the math and say, like, we make this number of people dependent. Because I always get the question about it. It's the same question surrounding illegal immigration. Are they just doing this to eventually, you know, create more Democrat voters? And my honest answer is, I think it's much more about the pathological compassion, right? They're highly emotional policymakers. They do not think about trade-offs, and they do not have the same moral values of sort of protecting your own domestic in-group, you know, and protecting your own borders. It's like, it goes way deeper into a firmer belief about how things should be, about, you know, just, again, this oversized sense of compassion and paternalistic worldview. You know, it does have the added benefit, of course, to them of maybe buying some votes here and there, but I don't think it buys as many votes as people think it does. I think more people are on the side of, no, I don't like to see somebody on disability who doesn't need it. The vast majority of Americans don't like to see that. The problem is a hard policy conversation, because you say, okay, so I say, look, I want to implement stricter standards on this. I want to get people off of disability quicker. You know, I want there to be more follow-up. I want all of these, I want work requirements. I want all that. Your average person who probably agrees with me, if you really set out the details, when I say average person, I'm going to say average, slightly left-leaning, compassionate person. You know, you're kind of an independent swing voter. They're still going to have that. Oftentimes, they still sort of side with Democrats because they don't want the risk of throwing a bunch of people on the street. You know, they're afraid of that risk, and so that's what makes this a very hard policy endeavor, to make those kind of changes. That's how we argue about it up here. And then we're told that we're not, you know, we're these terrible, evil people that want to throw Granny off cliffs. And it's like, no, there's a deeper understanding of how society needs to function. I think that is important. That goes all the way back to biblical times. So I actually want to give you an opportunity, because you talk about how often the Bible is mentioned, how often the Bible mentioned money and work, in your book. So what guidance does the Bible give to humanity regarding the value of work? I mean, it's an old idea.
Well, the point I try to make in the book, and really what kind of animated me to even write the book, is starting with my belief that it's why God created the world. That why he created mankind was that he desired a co-creator, that he made the world with a whole lot of potential. I've read Genesis 1 a lot. I've studied history. I do not believe there was an iPhone in Genesis chapter 1, but we do have iPhones now, and we haven't created any new raw material. So something happened by which the basic raw materials from sand, rubber, plastics, metal, and then a whole lot of human ideas and human ingenuity and trial and error brought us, and I'm skipping over obviously an awful lot of economic and technological evolution. But again, even phrases like economic and technological evolution, they are really encapsulations of human work. And that God created the world with potential so mankind could extract the actual out of that, that we could build the potential into meaningful civilization, to cultivate the world, to be fruitful, to multiply and fill it. And I say to my Christian friends that I get very bothered when we interpret that passage, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, as a commandment to procreation. I think you could argue it is, but it is most certainly not only that. The idea that you could fill up the earth but not have roads and not have cities and not have infrastructure and water wells. You know, from the second Adam and Eve were created, they started inventing the wheelbarrow and the wheel and how to start a fire and doing all the things that have advanced human civilization. This is all work. And God made us in his image. He himself was a worker, a producer, a creator, innovator. And I recognize theologically that mankind cannot create as God did out of nothing, but we can create out of what God created. And that is, to me, the story of work, and it's a universal story. Much like my belief of economics, I do not believe in an economic vision that has 50% of people producing so that the other 50% can consume. I think that all people were made to be productive, useful, and have a purpose. And that out of that work in which we do glorify God, we do honor God, we do obey him, he cares about the work itself. And that work is never us just throwing pebbles in a hole for fun. It is always extended towards an object. We are the subject that are doing work transitively towards an object, and that object is another human being. And when we put widgets in a box in a factory, we are producing goods and services that are going to meet the needs of somebody on the other side of the world that we're never going to meet. It's the beauty and miracle of a modern economy. And yet in our work, we are being paid to produce goods and services that meet others. Now, there is still a price mechanism. There's barriers to entry. It takes more education, more skill, more intelligence, more savvy to be a corner office lawyer, although sometimes maybe not, but I digress, than entry-level work. It's one of the issues where I'm kind of coming back to a prior conversation now when we talked about teenage employment. And then when they make the argument for minimum wage laws around a livable wage, my argument about what a livable wage ought to be for a person working at McDonald's is that I don't believe it is true that that job was ever created to be a livable wage. I think it is part-time employment for somebody, that it is the lowest level of skills required, the lowest level of education. It serves a purpose, but it has a low value proposition to the employer. And therefore it was a perfect job for teenage part-time employment. Fundamentally, whether one is a maid at a hotel, or is that more socioeconomically high strata position like a congressman or a corner office financier, I still believe the same thing theologically about the work, that they are still doing something that serves God's purposes, and that we ought to view it as dignifying, and that we are having our needs met by meeting the needs of others. And I think that represents a positively virtuous vision of work.
I agree. And do you think there's a problem in the religious community for not talking about that enough?
Yeah, I
And
think
bringing that up?
I think that in the Christian community that I'm most qualified to speak to, I think that they not merely a crime of omission, but a crime of commission. That when they talk about it, it is constantly apologetic, defensive. Hey, hey, you gotta quit working so much so you can focus on the really important things in life. And the sermons have become one big Hallmark movie where every corner office guy who's doing well in their career is supposed to go back to their small town over a holiday and fall back in love again with the small town post office and their ex-girlfriend from high school and feel guilty about their successful corporate job. It's an adorable movie to watch, but it's a ridiculous vision of the human life, and it certainly has no business being promoted from a pulpit.
No, that's true. And I think it's a problem across the board, whether it's work or other moral issues. I think too many ministers just don't want to offend the sensibilities of their congregation, and therefore, keep it rather simple and quote unquote inclusive. It depends on where you go. I mean, look, there's some sermons I love hearing, but I wouldn't mind if they leaned in a little bit. It's like you said, you got to shame. You got to do a little bit of shaming.
Yeah.
The Catholics are kind of good at that, but not good enough. And it's important to keep humanity on track. It was kind of the whole point. You talk about retirement too. I realize that we've already kind of hit our hour. So if you have to go, let me know. We're about to call votes for us. So, but retirement is kind of this other cultural, issue that has taken off where it's got to retire, got to live my best life. And, maybe back in the day that retirement only used to be a few years, but now it could be 30, 40, 50 years. How did we get to that point? How are retirees even surviving that long? And will I be able to do that? I'm not so sure. Just based on the financing that I deal with as a millennial compared to my grandparents, but maybe comments on that.
Well, I think where it came from was a byproduct of two really good things. It came from the fact that we all started living longer. So the higher mortality is a good thing. And then the prosperity that could afford such a thing is a good thing. We had retirement for years and years before Madison Avenue got a hold of the term in the 1960s. Retirement was called death. And that's what people's retirement plan was to work until they died, and then they didn't have to work anymore. But then we started living 10 years longer, and then we started living 20 years longer. And then things like pensions and 401ks and IRAs and other, financial products played into it, but also the products would be worthless without the overall means and prosperity of filling in those products. And so people were able to afford something like retirement to go with their extended mortality. Having greater financial freedom, financial convenience, margin, greater security in later ages and stages of life, none of that are things I'm critical of. What I'm critical of is the mentality that says the reason you work is to not do it anymore. I think that was the inheritance that baby boomers left millennials. And all millennials did was believe it and run with it and say, well, if you think the purpose of work is to get the hell out at age 60, I'm just going to do what you did at age 30. I'm going to have a very low view of work starting my career. And I think that the boomers worked very hard. They produced more goods and services than any generation in human history. But they did so with an eye on retirement, and really in a lot of ways, for many, not all, with a goal of trying to get back to a place of the leisure and recreation they had in their lives when they were younger. And you see some of these communities of these seniors drinking all day long, the idea of golfing 5 to 7 days a week and all that. I think it's just so depressing. I can't even believe it. I don't expect a 75-year-old to be working the same level they were when they were 45. Look, here in New York, a lot of them do. It's in their blood, man. They don't want to give up the game. They like the action. Not everyone is like that, but look, we need mentorship. We need seniority. We need experience. It is not a good thing that apparently the only profession left where we still celebrate people being really, really old is 2 people running for president of the United States.
Yeah. Yeah, for real. I wonder it would be an interesting survey to ask Americans if we were to give you $10 million right now, would you lock it away, invest it, and just keep working? Or would you just stop and retire? And maybe you have to play with that number a little bit. You could ask a number of questions, 10 million, 20 million, 50 million, just to see what percentage of the population is sort of in that category of, no, I work because I want to do things. Now maybe they want to change the kind of work they do, or you can see that happening, but at least it's still work. And that would be telling. And it would be telling to do it across the span of multiple decades. I wish I'd thought of this, when I was born in 1984 and told Pew Research and they could have done it, but it would be an interesting way to, or maybe there is something like that, a question like that I don't know about.
Yeah, I think that there is sort of metadata around lottery winners, for example. I can pretty much tell you that if we could get that kind of national survey done, guys like you and I would be very upset at the answers.
Yeah, I think it'd be a pretty high percentage. It's like, yeah, screw it. What's the point? I can just travel and do nice things. Now, look, in today's day and age, you can travel. You can work from home. There's a lot of jobs where you can work remotely.
Yeah.
That's okay. And maybe that's a lot of what we see. I do wonder, just not knowing exactly how we capture employment data, I do wonder how many people legitimately work and are productive and do things, but aren't necessarily captured in the data because they're in these sort of whatever. If they're an influencer on Instagram, I'm not really sure that is, but they're like a productive one, let's say, that actually sells ads and does all that. They definitely cost too much, and people I think are businesses probably pay too much for them. But in any case, it's a thing. Is that really captured in the broader data set of who's at work? I don't know.
Yeah, the BLS does a pretty good job there. And by the way, where there are deficiencies in the BLS methodology, they're consistent, right? Like, in other words, it's still giving you a relative sequence of data. So if it is flawed in capturing a certain thing one month, it was also flawed the next month or the last month. And so the direction of the data still has good meaning. But in terms of those that identify as self-employed, which is where some of these quote unquote influencers would show up, they do have a, I think, good way of capturing that data. And I always remind people when you hear these different conspiracy theories about, oh, the data is better than that, they're putting it out there to make someone look bad, or the data is worse than that, they're putting it out there to make Biden look better or something. The data point that comes from states, not the feds, is the data that doesn't lie, which comes every single Thursday morning, and that's initial unemployment claims.
Yeah.
And unless people believe that there's all of a sudden a whole lot of people who are really unemployed but are not collecting unemployment that they're legally entitled to, I tend to think that the data is probably pretty good. But like any data, whether it comes from the government or not, it's helpful to have 3 or 4 sources that help kind of validate and verify in a way that creates a sort of consistent narrative. And I think that there are changes in the workforce now, but I think that they're mostly captured in the data. And I don't believe it's perfect, but I think that the direction is still very useful.
So if we could focus on one thing to, ensure our economic growth is where we need it to be over the next 100 years, and assuming we don't do a great job of controlling our debt, which is a pretty valid assumption to make, but that risk is mitigated, of course, if we have a high growth economy. What would we focus on? Would it be labor force participation? Would it be getting people back to work? Would it be deregulation? You're going to start saying all the above. Some of the kind of
yeah, but a lot of those things are more tools within the other things. You have to have a more productive economy to get growth. Obviously, how do you get that? Things like deregulation remove impediments to growth. but the basic tautology of this, the sort of algebraic formula, is productivity growth plus population growth equals economic growth. So I would be advocating for the major variables. I want pro-legal immigration, pro-fertility. I like people having more than one kid.
Yeah.
And I would argue for greater productivity within the things they're doing, which would argue for less regulation, less tax, and then, yes, a higher labor participation force where more people are producing goods and services that meet the needs of humanity. The policy framework has a limited amount of things it can do. Lower marginal tax rates, less regulation, that kind of stuff. But the biggest issue, the lowest hanging fruit in this whole thing, is that sort of remoralization that the culture so desperately needs, where we shame 40-year-olds, 30-year-olds that are playing video games on mom's couch, and where we celebrate entrepreneurialism, celebrate risk-taking. These things would change the world if we could embrace it over the course of the next generation.
And it's what makes it unique here. I mean, everything we're talking about seems to have already ran its course in Europe, for instance, where, you know, it is deeply embedded in the culture there to relax. Like it's, you know, and it depends on the city you go to. London to me seems like a pretty bustling, work intensive kind of city. I was just in Vienna and it did not seem that way. It felt very, very different. And I was like, why is there no 24-hour CVS? This is driving me crazy. I have allergies, and I want to go and I want to be able to choose between a dozen different allergy medicines at 2 a.m. That's what I'm used to. It doesn't matter if I'm in a big city in America or the suburbs of America. That's what I'm used to. That's why people come here. That's why our border's overrun, because it's awesome. This place is awesome. And despite all the problems that we're talking about, but maybe it's awesome because we do discuss these problems and we perceive them as problems. And in this podcast, we have shamed. We have done a lot of shaming. And of course, and in other podcasts, I shame fat people. Like we do the shaming, all right? Because, you know, that's the number one thing that's going to drive up our healthcare costs. Sorry, but it's true. Like we need to work out more and exercise more. I need to work out more and exercise more. I should do it tonight. You know, it's so that we shouldn't, I always like to end on a somewhat optimistic note. At least we're the ones who have this conversation. At least this is kind of the last place where it all comes together. A lot of hard work going on in a lot of countries, but that's not a necessity. And they lack the political infrastructure and just societal institutions to make that work into something. That's why they all come here. I just think that's a good thing to say.
Well, I agree completely. And it's not only that we have these conversations and that relatively speaking, we're in a better place with a lot of these demographics and data points, even though some of them are worsening. But what we ultimately have is the DNA in our founding that it may end up happening. I pray to God it doesn't. But they do have to totally reprogram the American DNA before they can eliminate work and productivity. You know, that's a fascinating thing about Silicon Valley is I think most of it is on the wrong side of the culture war. Most of it's on the wrong side of the environmental discussion. But then all of a sudden you get to the celebration of productivity, innovation, and they look at leftists like they have three heads.
Yeah.
Because they're intuitively of the belief that innovation, production, creation are good things. That's a byproduct of the American DNA, and maybe the left will win this battle, but I don't think so. I think that ultimately we are really gloried beneficiaries of our founding.
I do. And you know, I say, what are we conserving as conservatives? And we've got to point it out more often. We're conserving the principles of the founding, and fundamentally the principles of the founding were, you know, proportional reward. You work this hard, you get this much. And if you try to socialize that, or equalize that, your economy will fail. It's been tried over and over again. And if Republicans come out front and say, look, we're for small business economics. That's the phrase I like. We're for small business economics. Because what makes it easier for a small business to thrive? less regulations, less taxes, just less things in your way because you don't have a team of lawyers to figure it all out. You don't even know when you're breaking the law. Big companies do. That's why they like to make more rules and more laws.
Yeah.
And that resonates with everybody. It really does. And, this is what frustrates me about our own Republican Party is we like to argue about a lot of other crap that frankly does not resonate with your average independent voter. And if we're going to win in November, which we might, I mean, it's not impossible. But it'll be a lot more possible if we focus on the things that actually matter. And those are boring and they don't make Fox News headlines, right? It's not defunding the FBI, right? And but it's what actually matters to people. So
Amen.
appreciate you being on and always writing and commenting on this stuff and giving us a solid voice, an educational voice on these issues, David. It's always fun to talk to you.
Thanks for everything you're doing, Congressman. Appreciate it very much.